Chapter J. Prudence. Introduction of the qualities or virtues attributed to the intellect. Prudence seems to be least concerned with knowledge and most concerned with action. When we call a man a scientist or an artist, or praise the clarity of his understanding, we imply only that he has a certain kind of knowledge. We admire his mind, but we do not necessarily admire him as a man. We may not even know what kind of man he is or what kind of life he leads. It is significant that our language does not contain a noun like scientist or artist to describe the man who possesses prudence. We must use the adjective and speak of a prudent man, which seems to suggest that prudence belongs to the whole man, rather than just to his mind. Prudence seems to be almost as much a moral as an intellectual quality. We would hardly call a man prudent without knowing his manner of life. Whether he behaved temperately would probably be much more relevant to our judgment of his prudence than whether he had a cultivated mind. The extent of his education or the depth of his learning might not affect our judgment at all, but we probably would consider whether he was old enough to have learned anything from experience and whether he had actually profited from experience to become wise. These observations not only express the ordinary sense of the word prudence, but also give a summary indication of the idea for which that word stands in the great books. Like other fundamental traits of mind or character, prudence is considered by the poets and historians in terms of precept and example. For the definition of the term or for an analysis of its relation to other fundamental ideas, such as virtue and happiness, desire and duty, one must go to the great works of moral and political theory or of theology. Even there, however, the conception of prudence is used more frequently than it is expounded. Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Hobbes, and Kant seem to be the exceptions, and of these only Aristotle and Aquinas offer an extended analysis, Aristotle in his book on intellectual virtue in the Ethics, Aquinas in certain questions of his treatise on habits in the Summa Theologica, but more extensively in his treatise on prudence. See the questions from the Summa Theologica cited in the list of additional readings. That prudence is not knowledge in the ordinary sense of the term, that it is a product of experience and a possession of reason which, unlike science or art, cannot be expressed in propositions, seems to be clearly implied by Hobbes. When the thoughts of a man, that has a design in hand, running over a multitude of things, observes how they conduce to that design, or what design they may conduce to, if his observations are such as are not easy or usual, this wit of his is called prudence, and depends on much experience and memory of the like things, and their consequences heretofore. Whereas science can achieve some certainty, the judgments of prudence are, according to Hobbes, all uncertain. Because to observe by experience and remember all circumstances that may alter the success, is impossible. It is the opposition between experience and science which seems to lead Hobbes to distinguish prudence from wisdom. As much experience is prudence, so is much science sapience. For though we usually have one name of wisdom for them both, yet the Latins did always distinguish between prudentia and sapientia, ascribing the former to experience, the latter to science. The Greeks also had two words, phronesis 472. Chapter 73, Prudence 473 and Sophia, both of which are sometimes translated in English by wisdom, but Aristotle, like Hobbes, insists upon the distinction between the wisdom which is the ultimate truth of the speculative sciences or philosophy and the wisdom which belongs to the sphere of moral and political action. Wishing to preserve Aristotle's sense that phronesis and Sophia have something in common which deserves the eulogistic connotation of wisdom, his translators usually render these words in English by the phrases practical wisdom or political wisdom, for phronesis, and speculative wisdom or philosophical wisdom, for Sophia. The English rendering of Aquinas, on the other hand, usually translates his prudentia by prudence, and his sapientia by wisdom. Whether it is permissible to use prudence and practical wisdom as synonyms may be more than a question of verbal equivalence, for there is a fundamental issue in theory concerning the unity of wisdom, on which Plato differs from both Aristotle and Aquinas. The question about the relation of knowledge and virtue may be differently answered according to the view of wisdom which denies its division into speculative and practical, and according to the view which conceives the possibility that a man may be wise in one way without being wise in the other. In the language of Aquinas, a man may have acquired wisdom through science and understanding without having the moral character of a prudent man. That practical wisdom is not scientific knowledge is evident, Aristotle declares. This is confirmed, he adds, by the fact that while young men become geometricians and mathematicians and wise in matters like these, it is thought that a young man of practical wisdom cannot be found. The reason is that such wisdom is concerned not only with universals but with particulars, which become familiar from experience, but a young man has no experience. For it is length of time that gives experience. Hobbes and Aristotle seem to agree that experience is important for the development of prudence or practical wisdom precisely because it is practical and practice is concerned with particulars. But though both also agree that this explains the distinction between prudence and scientific knowledge, which is concerned not with action but with the nature of things, Aristotle alone raises a further case Shion about the distinction between practical wisdom and art. In making something, the artist also deals with particulars. In this sense, art is also practical. But, according to Aristotle, the word productive should be used in distinction from practical to signify the difference between making and doing, two kinds of human activity which, though alike as compared with scientific knowing, represent knowledge differently applied. The knowledge which the artist possesses can, furthermore, be formulated in a set of rules. An individual can acquire the skill of an art by practicing according to its rules. What a man knows when he is prudent seems to be much less capable of being communicated by precept or rule. What he knows is how to deliberate or calculate well about things to be done. This, in Aristotle's view, marks prudence off from all other virtues. That prudence is a quality of mind seems to follow from the fact that it involves deliberation, a kind of thinking about variable and contingent particulars of the same sort which belong to the realm of opinion. That prudence is also a moral quality, an aspect of character, seems to follow no less from Aristotle's statement that prudence is not deliberation about the means to any sort of end, but only about those which conduce to the good life. In general, prudence is not always described as skill of mind in deliberating about alternative courses of action, nor is it always regarded as entirely praiseworthy or admirable, inseparable from virtue and the good life. It is, for example, sometimes identified with foresight or even conjecturing about the future. So conceived, prudence does not seem to require rational power so much as memory and imagination, in order to project past experience into the future. In this sense, Aristotle admits it may be said that even some of the lower animals have practical wisdom, viz., those which are found to have a power of foresight with regard to their own life, identifying prudence with foresight. Hobbes conceives perfect prudence as belonging only 474 the great ideas to God. When the event answers expectations, the prediction is attributed to prudence, yet human foresight being fallible, it is but presumption. For the foresight of things to come, which is providence, belongs only to him by whose will they are to come. Aquinas gives a quite different reason for saying that prudence or providence may suitably be attributed to God. It is that the ordering of things toward their ultimate end is the chief part of prudence, to which two other parts are directed, namely, remembrance of the past, and understanding of the present. Inasmuch from the remembrance of what is past and the understanding of what is present, we gather how to provide for the future. Prudence is sometimes described, not as a virtue of the mind, or even as the power of foresight, but as a temperamental trait, an emotional disposition. It is associated with timidity or caution in those who are fearful of risks or unwilling to take chances. It is in this sense that Bacon seems to oppose hopefulness to prudence, which is diffident upon principle and in all human matters augurs the worst. The cautiousness of the over-deliberate man may involve thought as well as fear. Hamlet thinks too much and on too many sides of every action. His action being sicklied o'er by the pale cast of thought, he is irresolute. He laments his misuse of reason, whether it be bestial oblivion, or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event. A thought, which quartered, hath but one part wisdom and ever 3 parts coward. I do not know why yet I live to say this things to do, since I have cause, and will, and strength, and means to do it. When prudence is conceived as excessive caution, its opposite is usually described as rashness, precipitateness, or impetuosity. Thucydides portrays these opposites in the persons of Nicias and Alcibiades. Their speeches to the Athenian assembly on the question of the Sicilian expedition do not merely present an opposition of reasons for and against the undertaking, but also represent an opposition of types of human character. Both come to grief. Nicias, the overcautious leader of the expedition, who earns a not inevitable defeat by his ever-delaying tactics, and Alcibiades, who does not stop at treachery or treason when the moment seems ripe for action which, if quickly taken, may succeed. Aristotle and Aquinas would use such facts to argue against what, in their view, is the misconception of the prudent man as the opposite of the impetuous. The prudent man, in their opinion, does not stand at the other extreme of undue caution. In their theory of the virtues as means between extremes of excess and defect, prudence, like courage or temperance, represents a mean consisting in neither too much nor too little. As cowardice and foolhardiness are the opposite vices of too much and too little fear, and as both are opposed to the mean of courage which involves a moderation of fear, so excessive caution and impetuosity are the vices opposed to prudence as well as to each other. Nor are prudence and imprudence simply matters of temperament. Men may differ in their temperamental dispositions, but, according to Aristotle and Aquinas, these are not to be confused with virtues and vices. One man may be by nature more fearful or fearless than another, but regardless of these differences in emotional endowment, either may become courageous, by forming the habit of controlling fear for the right reasons. So, too, one man may be naturally more impulsive or more circumspect than another, but either can acquire prudence through learning to take sufficient counsel and to deliberate enough before action, while also forming the habit of resolving thought into action by reaching decisions and commanding their execution. Failing to satisfy these conditions of prudence, either may develop the vices of imprudence, becoming, like Hamlet or Nicias, irresolute, or, like Alcibiades, impatient of counsel or ill-advised, lacking care in deliberation and soundness in judgment. The conception of prudence as itself the extreme of caution, whether temperamental or habitual, is not the only challenge to the Aristotelian theory of prudence as a virtue. Other moralists, especially those who take a different view of virtue generally, do not seem to look upon prudence as wholly admirable, even when they do not condemn prudence as an indisposition to act promptly or decisively. Chapter 73, Prudence 475. Enough, they seem to give prudent deliberation the invidious connotation of cold and selfish calculation. A suggestion of this appears in Mill's contrast between duties to ourselves and duties to others, wherein he remarks that the term duty to oneself, when it means anything more than prudence, means self-respect and self-development. It would seem to be implied that prudence means something less, something more selfish, than a proper and justifiable self-interest state, the violation of which involves a breach of duty to others, for whose sake the individual is bound to have care for himself. Kant, more explicitly than Mill, associates prudence with expediency and self-seeking, and separates it from action in accordance with duty under the categorical imperative of the moral law. Prudence has meaning only in relation to a hypothetical imperative which expresses the practical necessity of an action as a means to the advancement of happiness. Granted that a man seeks his individual happiness, then skill in the choice of means to his own greatest well-being may be called prudence. Consequently, the imperative which refers to the choice of means to one's happiness, i.e., the precept of prudence, is still always hypothetical. The action is not commanded absolutely, but only as a means to another purpose, or, as Kant says elsewhere, the maxim of self-love, prudence, only advises, the law of morality commands. Furthermore, he holds that what duty is plain of itself to everyone, but what it is to bring true durable advantage, such as will extend to the whole of one's existence, is always veiled in impenetrable obscurity, and much prudence is required to adapt the practical rule founded on it to the ends of life, even tolerably, by making exceptions, in terms of Kant's division of the imperatives of conduct into the pragmatic and the moral. According as they refer to welfare and happiness or duty and law, prudence is merely pragmatic. It does not belong to morality. The pragmatic imperative of prudence is more like the technical imperative of art, which is also conditional and concerned with determining means to an end, in this case, the thing to be produced by skill. If it were only equally easy to give a definite conception of happiness, the imperatives of prudence would correspond exactly with those of skill, as Kant sees it. The sole business of reason in the moral philosophy of prudence is to bring about a union of all the ends, which are aimed at by our inclinations, into one ultimate end, that of happiness, and to show the agreement which should exist among the means of attaining that end. In this sphere, accordingly, reason cannot present to us any more than pragmatical laws of free action, for our guidance towards the aim set up by the senses, and is incompetent to give us the laws which are pure and determined completely a priori. Hence the precepts of prudence are used by reason only as counsels, and by way of counterpoise against seductions to an opposite course. The issue between Kant and Aristotle, or Aquinas with respect to prudence thus appears to be part of the larger issue between them on the fundamental principles of morality. Discuss it in the chapters on duty and happiness. In Kant's view, Aristotle and Aquinas, no less than Mill, are pragmatists rather than moralists. They are all utilitarians in the sense that they regard happiness as the first principle of human conduct and concern themselves with the ordering of means to this end. Since the consideration of means necessarily involves the weighing of alternatives as more or less expedient, prudence becomes indispensable to the pursuit of happiness. The choice of the best means is second in importance only to the election of the right end. Kant admits that those who live for happiness require a great deal of prudence, in order to adapt practical rules to variable circumstances and to make the proper exceptions in applying them. None is required by those who live according to the moral law. The moral law commands the most punctual obedience from everyone. It must, therefore, not be so difficult to judge what it requires to be done, that the commonest unpracticed understanding, even without worldly prudence, should fail to apply it rightly. That the principle of private happiness is the direct opposite of the principle of morality, Kant seems to think is evident from the questionable worth of prudence, for a man must have a different criterion 476 The great idea is Ryan when he is compelled to say to himself, I am a worthless fellow, though I have filled my purse, and when he approves himself, and says, I am a prudent man, for I have enriched my treasure. Kant does not limit his criticism of prudence as pragmatic, or practical rather than moral to the fact that it serves what he calls private happiness, it may serve the public welfare. A history is composed pragmatically, he writes, when it teaches prudence, i.e., instructs the world how it can provide for its interests better, but he also distinguishes between worldly and private prudence. The former is a man's ability to influence others so as to use them for his own purposes. The latter is the sagacity to combine all these purposes for his own lasting benefit. Nevertheless, the prudence which aims at individual happiness is primary, for when a man is prudent in the former sense, but not in the latter, we might better say of him that he is clever and cunning, but, on the whole, imprudent. Those who take the view that happiness is the first principle of morality would still agree with Kant that the man who is skillful in exercising an influence over other men so as to use them for his own purposes, is clever or cunning rather than prudent. Hobbes, for example, says that if you permit to prudence the use of unjust or dishonest means, you have that crooked wisdom, which is called craft. Aristotle goes even further in his insistence that it is impossible to be practically wise without being good, or, as the same point is made in the language of Aquinas, one cannot have prudence unless one has the moral virtues, since prudence is right reason about things to be done, to which end man is rightly disposed by moral virtue. To be able to do the things that tend towards the mark we have set before ourselves is, according to Aristotle, to be clever. If the mark be noble, the cleverness is laudable, but if the mark be bad, the cleverness is mere smartness. Hence the man of prudence has a certain cleverness, but the clever man who is merely smart cannot be called practically wise. By this criterion the clever thief who plans and executes a successful robbery, the shrewd businessman who, without regard to justice, calculates well how to maximize his profits, or Machiavelli's prince who exercises cunning to get or keep his power, exhibits, not prudence, but its counterfeits. In some cases, the cleverness or shrewdness may simulate prudence without involving the knavery of craft or cunning. Some men have what Aquinas conceives as artistic, or technical, rather than